My friend's mom whispered the words I didn't expect. If you want me, prove it. And just like that, everything changed. It was one of those ordinary weekends that felt anything but ordinary. I had gone over to my friend's house under the pretense of helping him with some project, though part of me knew I was just looking for a break from my own restless thoughts. The house smelled of familiarity, the faint tang of old wood mingling with the crisp scent of freshly laundered linens. Sunlight spilled lazily through the kitchen window, scattering golden patches across the tiled floor. She was there, my friend's mom, though in my mind she felt like a presence apart from any familiar title. She moved through the kitchen with a quiet grace, her motions unhurried but precise, as though she had spent decades perfecting the way she existed in a room without demanding attention. Her hair, the soft shade of autumn chestnuts, caught the light in delicate highlights. I noticed the way she brushed a stray strand behind her ear, the subtle tilt of her head, the curve of her lips as she hummed under her breath, a sound so easy, so private, yet it reached me in a way that made my chest tighten. Our eyes met briefly over the rim of my friend's cereal bowl. It wasn't a look charged with overt intention, rather, it was an unspoken acknowledgement, a recognition that lingered far longer than the moment should have allowed. There was something in her gaze, curiosity tempered with warmth, that caught me off guard. It was fleeting, just a fraction of a second, but it left a residue, a quiet echo in my thoughts. I remembered the small details that my mind clung to, the delicate perfume she wore, a mixture of vanilla and something floral, barely there but lingering in the space between us, the way her hand rested on the counter, fingers brushing lightly over the edge of a worn cookbook, the faint lines of her palm catching the sunlight, even the way her shoulders relaxed slightly as she exhaled. A rhythm so natural I found myself studying it without meaning to. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, pouring my own cup of coffee, adjusting a chair, but every movement felt heightened. Her presence seemed to draw me in, a subtle gravity I hadn't noticed before. It was nothing I could name, and yet it felt enormous. For a moment I wondered if she sensed it too, the strange awareness that our worlds, usually so separate, had just collided in that quiet kitchen. It wasn't a flirtation. Not in any conscious way. Just seeing. For years she had been a presence in my life. But in that moment she became a person. It was more a spark of recognition, a fleeting alignment of two lives that rarely crossed in such intimate proximity. And yet I knew, even as I tried to convince myself otherwise, that this was the kind of moment that could quietly unravel everything I thought I understood about boundaries and desire. By the time my friend called me to help with something in the living room, she had moved on to her morning routine, humming again, her hands occupied. But the kitchen, once just a backdrop to weekend chores, had transformed in my mind. The smell of coffee, the sunlight, the faint warmth of her presence, they all lingered, unspoken and unresolved. And I realized, with a curious mix of hesitation and anticipation, that something had begun here. Something slow. Something entirely unexpected. After that first morning in the kitchen, things didn't change outwardly. I kept my focus on the reason I was there, to help my friend, but now, everything seemed subtly different. The air carried a quiet tension I couldn't quite name, a rhythm that made even small interactions feel heightened. It started with casual conversation. She appeared in the living room while I was helping my friend arrange some old books on a shelf. "Do you even like reading, or is this just torture for you?" she asked, her voice light but teasing. I glanced up, and her eyes caught mine, sparkling with amusement. There was an ease in her tone, but behind it, I sensed a quiet challenge. I like some books," I said, fumbling slightly, my words tripping over themselves. She laughed softly, a warm, melodic sound that lingered in the room. I realized I was holding my breath, caught in the gentle sway of her presence. We started talking more often after that, in small bursts. Sometimes it was about music. She noticed I had a fondness for old records, and would casually mention her own favorites. Other times, it was life advice disguised as casual observation. "You know, it's better to say what you think than stay quiet," she said one afternoon, tilting her head as she studied me. Her words felt light, but they carried weight, as though she were testing my attentiveness and patience. The subtlety of it all made my mind spin. I noticed the details. The soft crease of her sleeve as she leaned forward, resting an elbow lightly on her knee. The faint scent of her perfume that seemed to follow her into the room. The way her gaze lingered for just a heartbeat longer than polite. Once, her hand brushed against my arm accidentally, or maybe intentionally, and a small warmth traveled up my skin. My pulse stuttered, and I told myself it was nothing, just an accident. But her eyes held a spark of something knowing, and I couldn't quite dismiss it. Even mundane tasks became charged. Passing her the butter at breakfast felt like a deliberate test. Handing her the folded laundry seemed to carry a message I wasn't meant to fully understand. I found myself leaning slightly closer, drawn to the quiet steadiness of her presence. There was an intimacy in those moments that didn't require words, just a gentle awareness, an unspoken understanding that neither of us would name aloud yet. Her laughter became my anchor in the room, her gentle teasing a constant that reminded me she noticed me in ways my friend never could. And every time I caught her glance, I felt a curious combination of excitement and hesitation, as if standing on the edge of something forbidden but thrilling. By the end of the day, I realized that the house, once ordinary, had begun to feel like a stage for a slow, delicate dance. Our interactions were small, subtle, and entirely YouTube-safe, yet each carried a weight that pulled at the corners of my mind. A simple conversation, a brush of a hand, a lingering look, they were enough to keep me thinking about her long after I left. And in that awareness, I felt the first stirrings of something that neither of us were ready to name, a connection that was quiet, tentative, and entirely magnetic. A few days after our light-hearted exchanges, the air between us shifted, though neither of us spoke it aloud. I found myself lingering a little longer in her presence, noticing the subtleties. The quiet tilt of her head when she listened, the soft catch in her breath as she moved between rooms, the occasional absent-minded brush of her fingers against the surface. There was an unspoken weight to her energy, a hint that beneath her confident exterior, there was something fragile, something that rarely surfaced. It was a rainy afternoon when it finally happened. I had come over to help with something trivial, organizing boxes in the garage, but she followed me, carrying 2 mugs of tea, her movements calm yet deliberate. "I wasn't expecting company," she said lightly, setting a mug down near me. But there was a softness in her eyes, a quiet invitation that made my chest tighten. We sat on the garage steps, the rain tapping gently against the roof above us. She sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth seep into her hands, and I realized she had chosen a spot where our shoulders nearly touched. I felt the faint heat radiating from her, a comforting steadiness that contrasted with the storm outside. "You know," she began, her voice lower, more tentative than usual. "Sometimes I feel like I'm stuck in a life I didn't quite plan." Her gaze drifted toward the rain-slicked driveway, and I noticed a tremor in her fingers as she clasped the mug. "I thought I had it all figured out, but things don't always turn out that way." I didn't interrupt. I just listened, aware that this was a rare glimpse behind the confident mask she wore for everyone else. The vulnerability in her voice, the quiet way she admitted uncertainty, made my chest ache with empathy and something deeper I didn't fully understand. You don't have to say anything," she added quickly, as if sensing my thoughts. I wanted someone to know. Even if it's just for a moment." Her eyes flicked toward mine, searching, hesitant. I noticed the faint quiver in her lips, the way her breath hitched slightly when she spoke, and I felt a protective warmth bloom in my chest. Without thinking, I reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was gentle, deliberate, and my fingers lingered just long enough for her to feel the comfort in it. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest near mine, and for a brief heartbeat, our connection was wordless but absolute. That was the moment I understood the depth of her complexity, the graceful exterior shielding quiet fears and unspoken desires. It wasn't about seduction, it was about recognition, about being seen. And in seeing her, I realized that the subtle tension between us had shifted. It was no longer just curiosity or fleeting attraction. It had become something profound, tender, and undeniably real. We stayed there in silence, the rain falling around us, the warmth of our hands near each other, the shared breath and quiet understanding filling the space. It was a small confession, a fragile trust, but it planted a seed, one that would grow slowly, quietly, and irrevocably. The days that followed her confession were a delicate dance of glances, subtle touches, and lingering silences. Every interaction carried the weight of unspoken feelings, yet neither of us dared to name them. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, in the living room filled with the golden light of late afternoon, that she finally spoke the words that would shift everything. I had been helping her carry some boxes from the attic, my arms brushing against hers now and then, each contact sending a small jolt through me. When we set the last box down, she stood back, crossing her arms loosely over her chest, and gave me that familiar, knowing look. There was a playful intensity in her gaze, the kind that suggested she was testing me, measuring something invisible. "If you want me," she said slowly, letting the words hang in the air, "you'll have to prove it." The sentence hit me like a quiet thunderclap. My heart thudded against my ribs, and I felt a mixture of excitement, hesitation, and something I didn't yet have the words for. Her lips curved slightly, almost teasingly, but there was seriousness beneath it, a challenge wrapped in warmth. She wasn't asking for grand gestures or empty promises. She wanted sincerity, patience, and understanding. She wanted to see if I could match the emotional depth she had shown me. I swallowed hard, aware of the closeness between us. Our shoulders were nearly touching, the soft fabric of her sweater brushing my arm as she shifted slightly. There was an electricity in that small contact, a silent confirmation of the tension that had been building for days. I wanted to respond, to say something clever or profound, but words felt insufficient. Instead, I simply met her gaze, letting my expression convey my willingness, my attention, and my curiosity. She smiled softly, a gentle acknowledgement of my hesitation, and added, almost as an afterthought, "I'm not looking for impulsive gestures. I want patience, thoughtfulness, someone who sees me, really sees me." The way she spoke it made my chest ache with desire, not physical, but emotional. It was an invitation, a test, and a promise all at once. For the first time, I felt the weight of the age difference, not as a barrier, but as a quiet reminder of the experience and depth she carried. She wasn't just testing me, she was offering a chance to grow, to prove my capacity for understanding and care. I realized that this challenge wasn't about romantic conquest, it was about connection, trust, and emotional courage. I nodded slowly, my hand brushing against hers as I did, just enough to let her feel my commitment without forcing intimacy. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let the contact linger, her fingers grazing mine in a subtle acknowledgement of the shared understanding between us. That single, fleeting touch carried more weight than any spoken declaration could. And in that moment I knew that the slow burn between us had shifted. Her challenge wasn't a demand, it was an invitation into something profound. The tension, the curiosity, the unspoken desire, all of it would need to be proven through patience, thoughtfulness, and genuine care. And I was ready, more than ever, to take the first step. This keynote heightens the romantic tension, establishes her as confident yet vulnerable, and frames his emotional journey forward. The subtle touches, lingering glances, and internal stakes make it perfect for a slow-burn YouTube narrative. The challenge she had set lingered in my mind like a quiet echo. "Prove it," she had said, and I understood then that this wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about noticing her, understanding her, and responding in ways that showed I cared, thoughtful, patient, and genuine. I began paying attention to the little things. When she mentioned how her favorite mug was chipped, I made a point of finding a small replacement, leaving it on the counter with a casual, "Thought you might like this." She noticed immediately, her eyes lighting up with a warmth that made my chest tighten. It wasn't just gratitude, it was recognition. I was learning the language she spoke, quiet and subtle, carried in gestures more than words. Our afternoons became punctuated by these small moments. Sometimes I'd offer to help with chores, not out of obligation but because I could see the relief in her eyes when someone quietly shared the load. On one rainy evening, we found ourselves sitting on the couch together, sharing a blanket while the storm tapped rhythmically against the windows. She leaned back slightly, and without thinking, I shifted closer. My arm brushed hers, the warmth of her sleeve against my skin sending an unexpected thrill through me. She didn't move away, she just let the space between us shrink, and in that silence, a quiet intimacy settled. Even casual touches carried weight. When her hair fell across her face while she read, I tucked it behind her ear, my fingers lingering just long enough to feel the softness and warmth of her skin. Her eyes met mine, and for a heartbeat, everything else faded, the hum of the house, the distant sound of cars outside, even my own racing thoughts. There was a gentle acknowledgement in that glance, an unspoken conversation that needed no words. I also learned to listen. When she spoke about her day, about worries or fleeting frustrations, I didn't rush to offer solutions or advice. I simply listened, letting my presence be a steady comfort. And she noticed. A smile would tug at her lips, or she'd let her hand rest lightly against mine, an almost imperceptible brush that spoke volumes. Even our walks became exercises in subtle connection. A shared step, a hand brushing against mine as we adjusted our pace, a quiet laugh at something trivial, each moment became a test of attentiveness, an opportunity to show her I was present in the way she needed. I realized that her challenge wasn't just about proving desire, it was about proving emotional understanding, care, and patience. And each small act, each thoughtful gesture, became a thread weaving us closer together. She responded in kind, her touches lingering a little longer, her gaze softening when she caught me looking at her. By the end of that week, the distance between us had shrunk in ways words couldn't capture. It wasn't dramatic or rushed, it was quiet, steady, and deliberate. Each touch, each glance, each act of care was a silent affirmation. I was proving it, not with force or words, but through presence, attention, and shared moments. And in those moments, I felt the slow, undeniable pull of something far deeper than attraction, a connection that was emotional, tactile, and profoundly real. This keynote emphasizes his gradual proof, through small, meaningful gestures, highlighting their growing intimacy without crossing into explicit territory. The slow burn tension and subtle physicality make it perfect for YouTube storytelling. By now, the quiet gestures and subtle touches had created a rhythm between us, a shared language of glances, light brushes, and lingering presence. But with that rhythm came a new awareness, one that made every interaction both exhilarating and heavy. I felt it most in the silence after a shared laugh, or when our hands accidentally lingered a fraction too long. Every small moment carried a question: how far could this go? And more importantly, should it? One evening, she invited me to help her in the garden. The sun was dipping low, painting everything in warm golds and oranges, the scent of wet earth mixing with the faint perfume she always wore. We worked side by side, pruning roses and planting seedlings, our hands occasionally brushing as we reached for tools. Each accidental touch made my heart jump, and I caught myself staring at her face longer than necessary, noticing the faint glimmer of sweat on her temple, the way her hair fell in soft waves across her shoulder. Yet beneath the warmth, there was hesitation. I was acutely aware of the age difference, the social implications, and the boundaries that had always kept this attraction unspoken. Each glance at her inviting smile, each soft laugh, tugged me closer, while my mind pushed back, reminding me of consequences, propriety, and caution. It was a constant tug-of-war between desire and restraint. She seemed to sense it. At one point, she paused, leaning slightly against the wooden fence, her eyes studying me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "You're thinking too much," she said softly, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. Her voice carried both teasing and concern, and I felt a lump form in my throat. How could she see so much without saying anything? We moved closer as we worked, and our hands met again, this time lingering a fraction longer than before. I felt the warmth of her skin, the subtle pressure of her fingers against mine, and the electricity of proximity that words couldn't capture. My chest tightened with conflicting emotions: longing, hesitation, fear, and an undeniable sense of connection. The sun slipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the garden. In that quiet moment, I realized that we were both testing the invisible lines, either willing to rush, yet unable to completely hide our feelings. Every glance, every brush of skin, every pause in conversation was a negotiation between desire and restraint. Finally, as she straightened up, brushing soil from her hands, I spoke softly, almost to myself. "I don't want to mess this up. I don't want to hurt you." She stepped closer, her hand brushing mine once again, and said, with gentle reassurance, "I know. And that's why I'm here. That's why we can take it slow, together." In that exchange, the tension didn't vanish, it transformed. It became a shared acknowledgement of our desires, fears, and the emotional courage it would take to move forward. The conflicted heart wasn't a barrier anymore. It was the very thing binding us closer, making the eventual resolution feel earned, tender, and inevitable. The days that followed the garden afternoon felt different, lighter somehow, though still filled with that delicious tension that had been building between us. We continued our quiet routines, but now each glance, each gesture, carried a new significance. I realized I no longer wanted to hide what I felt, and neither did she. The unspoken was slowly becoming spoken through our presence, our care, and our attentiveness. One evening, as the sky painted itself in deep purples and soft pinks, she invited me to sit with her on the porch. A light breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers and a faint trace of her perfume. The air felt warm, intimate, as though the world outside had paused for this moment. We shared a blanket, the fabric soft against our shoulders, and the quiet of the evening gave space for the connection we had been nurturing to speak for itself. She looked at me with that familiar mixture of confidence and vulnerability, and I saw the flicker of anticipation in her eyes. I reached out, gently taking her hand in mine, and she allowed it without hesitation. The warmth of her skin against mine, the subtle pulse beneath her fingers, made my chest tighten with a feeling that was part comfort, part exhilaration. "I think I've been waiting for this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a confession of love in words, but a declaration of trust, of willingness, of shared understanding. I squeezed her hand gently, letting her know that I understood, that I had been waiting for the same, and that I was ready to move forward with care and sincerity. Our touches were deliberate, careful, and yet full of meaning. Her hand rested against mine, our fingers intertwining naturally. At one point, she leaned slightly closer, her shoulder brushing against mine, and I felt the steady warmth of her body, the calm rhythm of her breathing. I instinctively leaned closer, allowing my cheek to hover near hers, sensing the quiet steadiness of her presence. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't flashy, it was perfect in its subtlety. We talked in whispers, sharing thoughts, hopes, and small admissions that we had held back before. Laughter came easily, soft and warm, mingling with the distant sounds of the neighborhood. In that space, there were no boundaries, no judgments, just the quiet assurance of two people who had grown close, carefully, deliberately, and meaningfully. As the sun finally disappeared and the first stars appeared, we sat there in companionable silence, hands still entwined. I felt the culmination of all the small gestures, the subtle touches, the patient proof of care we had shared. Every glance, every brush of skin, every quiet moment had led to this, a connection fully acknowledged and warmly embraced. For the first time, the tension that had driven us to test and prove ourselves gave way to something enduring. It wasn't explosive or sudden, it was gentle, steady, and infinitely more satisfying. I realized that this slow burn had achieved its purpose. Two hearts had found each other, carefully, thoughtfully, and with a depth that made every moment leading here worthwhile. And as we sat there, hands intertwined, gazing at the night sky, I understood fully that this connection, born from patience, understanding, and subtle affection, was ours, and it would only grow stronger from here.